When somebody pictures the Western Sephardi Jewish world, there's a particular aesthetic that comes to mind, which isn't just accidental, but it's something that captures a particular characteristic of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and that expresses a particular religious value system, which is intentional within the Western Sephardi Jewish diaspora. And so in this lecture on what we're generally calling the religious culture of the Western Sephardim, we're going to focus specifically on the material culture, right? The aesthetic of the Western Sephardi Jews. And by that we mean its architecture, music, the clothing, and the objects, the religious objects of this community. We're going to be looking at them as we've been throughout these courses, not kind of focusing on any specific community and not kind of going into detail of the specific objects, but trying to show a trend that you can kind of see across, kind of spanning the Western Sephardi diaspora, that kind of collectively demonstrates what it is that we're trying to understand about what is the religious worldview, right? What are the values of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, which is distinct from other Jewish diasporas, as you would expect that different Jewish communities had somewhat different, perhaps, religious worldviews or kind of value systems, obviously all rooted within the Jewish tradition, but taking on, slightly different approaches to different things. And it's important because it also, as we'll see, is not just kind of something that is in a vacuum, but it impacts the minhag, the customs of the community too. There's an interplay between the material culture, the aesthetic of the community, and the community's customs, right? The community's minhagim. And that's really interesting because they don't only stem from religious, rationale, but sometimes there's an interplay when it comes to customs that have to do with the location and like I said, different styles of a community that kind of integrate and come together that create a way of doing things in the synagogue or kind of within one's religious life, that come together to create kind of this religious culture of the Western Sephardi Jews. And so it would be really important to kind of see how these impacts play out. But ultimately, and this is the main thing, and the thing that I think ultimately is the most important about it, is that it reflects a particular value system. And that value system gets at the very heart of the approach to Torah, the approach to Judaism, right? The approach to the world that is, shall we say, underpins this Western Sephardi world. That ultimately is probably the most important thing about this community, right? Which is the way that it understands the world, right? How it relates to Judaism and its place within the world. That, in my mind, is the thing that makes it so important, and you might say something which is at times maybe threatened, right, to survive as a religious worldview, but is actually the legacy of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews that I think is actually really compelling and important, and so important that other people should be able to connect to it and learn from it and hopefully be inspired by it, whether they're Spanish and Portuguese Jews or not, because it's something which is actually quite precious and actually creates a roadmap, as it were, to what it is to be a Jewish person in our times. And this, of course, is not surprising, as we're Jews living in the modern world, but very much living in a world that was not entirely unusual for the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, right? They were the first Jews to live in kind of the modern liberal state. And so in a sense, their approach to things were kind of the first Jews to encounter that kind of modern world, right? Not living in ghettos, not being kind of relegated to second-class citizens, but kind of being equal citizens in the modern liberal state. And so, in a sense, they have been doing it for hundreds of years, while many other Jewish communities around the world obviously were dealing with oppression and a kind of a different kind of experience, and in a sense are newer to the world in which we find ourselves in today. So I think there's a lot to learn from a Jewish community that's actually been doing it longer than anybody else. So that's kind of just by way of introduction. What we're going to do is we're going to actually go into some of these specific topics of architecture, music, clothing, objects, and kind of see what those things in a sense looked like, kind of to understand them a little bit more. And we'll go through them in a bit of detail. And at the end, we'll kind of take a step back and think about, what is it that we actually have to learn, or what are the messages that are conveyed right through this kind of exploration that we're going on in this particular talk. So let's start by looking at some of the synagogues of the Western Sephardim. We're going to look through lots of them. I'll talk about the different ones that you can see. The one over here, that's the synagogue in Amsterdam, the great Portuguese synagogue built in 1675. And the synagogue on the top right is in Barbados. Yeah, that one was rebuilt in about 1830, but had been a much earlier building originally. There'd been a fire and they'd rebuilt it. And the synagogue down at the bottom is from Curacao. And that was from around 1730. Okay, so this reflects kind of one particular lookout of it. And one of the things that you see when you look at these buildings, right, is when you think about Spanish and Portuguese Jews, right, what you would imagine in your mind would be a very Iberian, right? It's an Iberian community, that there would be a very distinctive Iberian aesthetic. But that's completely absent, right, in these synagogues that you see, right? They're not Iberian at all, right? In fact, these ones are particularly kind of Dutch, right, within their style. And there you start to see something that's at first kind of surprising, but actually is probably intentional, where it's not Iberian. You'll find that many synagogues that were built in the 19th century, even in Ashkenazi communities in Europe, intentionally adopt an Iberian aesthetic, right? This kind of Moorish architecture. But that's not what you find with the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, right? Their synagogues were not Moorish in design. Their synagogues are kind of, I would say, intentionally Western in their design, right? So we don't have the interiors in these images, but when you think about kind of the interiors of, let's say, Bevis Marks Synagogue, and we'll see some pictures in a moment, there's columns, right? It's something which feels very kind of Greco-Roman, right, in style, right? The Corinthian Doric, columns that are there. And so there's a very kind of intentional Western approach in the aesthetic of the community. And that's something which is really important. Let me just see what I have here in terms of the pictures. So, let's see here. Yeah. Fine. So let's take a moment then in thinking about it, right? Because when you look at that, because here in the middle we have, right, a historic image of Bevis Marks Synagogue. Yeah. So there is something about it which really interesting, right? Which is, it has this, and to say that the synagogues have a distinctive layout to them, right? So in all these synagogues, you'll find, they got typically 12 pillars holding up the gallery. The seats face towards the middle, right, not forward. The reader's desk, the teba, is set towards the back. There's no parochet, there's no curtain on the hechal, on the ark, like you might find in other synagogues, right? There's a very kind of like typical layout to all of these synagogues. But one of the things that you find is that in each of the synagogues, there's a slightly different aesthetic with them, right? So, right, the top one looks very more kind of brick, right? It kind of European in style, right? These buildings down below with the bright colors, right? They feel Caribbean, right? They feel very much kind of that place. And so what you find is that there's often this interplay within Spanish and Portuguese synagogues that they tend to share the same layout in terms of the, shall we say, the bones of the synagogue, right? In terms of the way that the interior is laid out, which would be different from other synagogues where you might have the reader's desk towards the front or front-facing seats, things like that, right? So the Spanish and Portuguese style will be mimicked in all of these different synagogues, but the aesthetic of the synagogues will be particularly local in design, right? So whether it's kind of the colors that are used, if you look, in the interior of some of the Caribbean synagogues, they may have sand on the floor or whitewashed walls, right? They'll feel very Caribbean. If you go to the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, it's colonial in style. Yeah, we'll go back to it later, but that one in the bottom right over there, right? That's very much feels colonial in its design. And so what you find is that the synagogues are very much kind of have this reflection of the local place where they're built, even though the layout will be the same from synagogue to synagogue. And so again, you find this really important interplay or kind of thing happening where the community seems to be intentionally interested to situate their architectural style within the local aesthetic of wherever the synagogue is built, right? So in a sense, the synagogues fit into their local landscape, right? They don't stand out as being kind of foreign in nature. They look like buildings that should be in London, right? It looks like a building that you would find in the Caribbean, right? It looks like a building you would find in colonial America, right? Touro Synagogue is from 1763. And so with each of these things, you find that they're trying to be local, they're trying to fit in the place where they are, but it's a synagogue, and again, the kind of the layout of the interior is still the same, right? So it's still being a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, even though from place to place, they look a little bit different, but they're all Western in style, okay? Now, one of the things to just notice, and this is something just to kind of take note of, is all of these kind of synagogues have a bit more of a similar style to them in terms of like the number of lots of windows on the front, and kind of this type of style, which is different than what you find at Bevis Marks. Yeah, because if you look at Bevis Marks, so Bevis Marks has 3 in the front, right? 3 on the top level, 2 on the bottom level of the door, and it has a bit more of a simple type of style to these, where there's like a lot going on with them. Yeah. And what you find in these synagogues that I'm showing here is these are all synagogues that were built in British territories, and they all seem to be modeled after Bevis Marks. So I'll just show you what they all are. The top right is just a drawing of the synagogue that was built in New York City in 1730, which is called the First Mill Street Synagogue. So this is kind of the one depiction we have of what that synagogue had looked like. It doesn't survive. It seems to kind of be a miniature, probably, version of Bevis Marks. Over here, you have a synagogue that was in Spanish Town in Jamaica. This was destroyed in a hurricane, I think in like the late 19th century. But take away the portico, and it really looks like Bevis Marks. Yeah, and the Touro Synagogue also really looks like Bevis Marks. It has a bit more of a colonial feel to it, but it's very much kind of the same as Bevis Marks Synagogue, right? And so all these synagogues are kind of from the 18th century, built in British lands and so on. So you kind of see the kind of, when you think of like, these Spanish and Portuguese communities that were in the Netherlands and that were in London, right, in Britain, they kind of have similarities between them. But even with that, they all have some element that feels really local to the specific place where they were built. Now, the thing that's interesting about them, right, they all have like this very kind of like balanced layout to them. Yeah, like in terms of like architectural style, there's something which is like very orderly. It's like, like a rectangular shape. Everything is, the same number of things on each side, right? We might think of these as like Georgian style, even though some of these are built before the Georgian era, right? It's very much this kind of simple type of style, something which is orderly, balanced, kind of like a simple elegance to them, yeah? And again, that's not completely by accident, because again, if you think of the Spanish and Portuguese Minhag, the traditions, that's very much what the traditions are like, right? Everything is orderly, everything is done with kind of a calmness to them, right? There isn't, kind of jumping up and down and kind of running around. Everything is done, done gently and carefully and with a dignified elegance to it. And that's something very much you find within the architecture too, that it also has that kind of feel to it. And so you can kind of see how it really kind of fits together, where the kind of the styles of the buildings feel very much in keeping with the styles of the services within the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues themselves. And so again, so what you see within them is again this very kind of like Western type of style, where you kind of like imagine of, what England was like in the 18th century, the fine, ladies and gentlemen, and everything kind of being done in a particular type of way. And that's something which has been adopted within the Spanish and Portuguese style. So again, not feeling particularly Iberian. Yeah, so even the communities from Spain and Portugal, we spent a lot of time in the lecture talking about what's the origin of the minhag. Is it from a particular region in Spain and Portugal that it comes from? Despite that, well, and maybe surprisingly, it's actually, the synagogue feels not Spanish and Portuguese. Yeah, it feels Western, and that's really interesting. There's a chapter that's just come out, an article by a Dr. David Sklar, where he looked at the prayer books in Amsterdam in the 17th century, and what he found is that they were evolving. So it wasn't like, there was a fixed liturgy. It's unsurprisingly largely based on what was happening in Venice, right? That's something that we spoke about in the lecture about the origin of the minhag. But he finds that it's actually still a bit evolving, right? That there still is some local decisions that are being made, right? Which on one level means that the minhag, in that sense, is not an exact copy of something that came before it, but actually kind of took on some new elements. And that's maybe not surprising when you see that architecturally and things like that is obviously a departure. They're doing something intentional that feels local to the places where they are. So in a sense, when we think of the minhag of the Spanish and Portuguese and where does it come from, it in part might be that it doesn't come from anywhere. It's something new, right? It's something that was created in these places where they lived. So it's drawing from an earlier tradition, but actually it wouldn't be like if you went to a particular place in Spain in the 14th century, it would be done exactly the way that it's done at Bevis Marks. Yeah, it kind of took on perhaps a slightly different form, a more kind of Western quality to it in Amsterdam, in London, in the Americas, which is really interesting then kind of when thinking about it and saying, the S&P kind of coalesced and evolved until it became, more fixed, and it became, that's Spanish and Portuguese minhag, that's the way of doing it. And you can kind of see that within the buildings are doing something different, right? They're really kind of feeling like the places in where they come from. And again, that's something which is really important because it's important to the community to fit in the places where they are, right? They're not looking to be different, right? They have a different faith, a different way of worship, but they're also part of the places where they live and they want to fit in with that, right? And that ability to kind of balance, to say, we can be of the place where we live while also being true to our own traditions, and that those things aren't in conflict with one another, is something which is really important to the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, right? And it starts to kind of indicate what we mean when we talk about the values of the S&P is this element of not being isolationist, right? Not being other, right? It's about being, yes, distinct, but also part of the places in which they live, right? So not kind of this, what you might find in some faith communities where they really want to keep separate. That's not the approach of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They see that they should be part of the world, part of society. They shouldn't stand out. They should integrate, but they should be different, right? They should still maintain their traditions, right? So you see that in the synagogues, right? The synagogues fit in the style of where they live, but they're synagogues. They're not building a church. They're building a synagogue, but it's a synagogue that fits in the place where they live. And we'll see that type of approach being copied within all the different things that we're going to talk about within this lecture. So you start to get the sense of saying, wow, this is really, not just intentional, but integral to the identity and character of this community, because you find it through everything that they are doing. Okay. So let's move on then to talk about the music. Can't show the music in pictures, right? But for those who have experienced a Spanish and Portuguese tradition service, you'll be familiar that the melodies, again, are very Western, right? There's a certain kind of melodic character to them, right? They don't sound North African or Middle Eastern in style, right? So if someone from other Sephardi communities come to a Spanish and Portuguese service, they're often surprised or kind of, not sure what to make of it, because it doesn't sound the style of other Sephardi congregations, obviously different than other Ashkenazi congregations. And again, it's something which is kind of becomes unique to the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. If you think about the type of music, you start having feelings of Italian Renaissance, or Handel, right? Those kinds of style of music that feel very, again, kind of this 18th century Western European type of musical tradition. And even though you may go to different Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, and they might sometimes even have some different melodies, or melodies that are similar but slightly different, they all have that character to them. So if you're going to a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York, or in London, or in France, they're going to still have that feel of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, even if it's sometimes different melodies. And even though sometimes the music isn't all from the 18th century, some of it might be written in the 19th century, some might be in the 20th century, but it's all in keeping with the style of the Western Sephardim, which is relaxed, melodic, easygoing, right? So again, not jumping up and down kind of music, right? Not kind of the rah-rah that you might find in kind of more contemporary, kind of modern Jewish music that maybe some synagogues have adopted, incorporated into their service, right? You think of Carlebach style, right? And different kinds of musical traditions, right? Or obviously the kind of the music that you might find in Middle Eastern synagogues, right? That have perhaps more kind of this kind of Arabic quality to them. Yeah, those kinds of elements are kind of foreign to the Western Sephardim. The music of the synagogue feels very Western in its style. Yeah, and so again, that's something which is interesting, and again reflects this idea that the aesthetic of the people, unsurprisingly, is influenced from the place where they live. Yeah. So if that's the popular kind of music, then there's a desire to make the synagogue feel like that. Yeah. And so it becomes distinctive to the service as well, right? So in the same way that you might find synagogues today taking more of like a rock kind of feel to their music, or pop style to the music, and then incorporating that into the music of the synagogue, right? So that's what they were doing in the 18th century. They were taking kind of what was the popular style of music, which was very refined and classy, right? Gentlemanly, yeah, and making that also the style of the synagogue music. And that's been retained within the Spanish and Portuguese. And so the result of that is that the way the service is conducted feels very, of a different time. It feels like you've entered the 18th century. There's a certain charm to it. Now that's the Spanish and Portuguese, right? That's something that becomes part of the character of it. For people who aren't used to it, they come in, it's almost a bit off-putting, because nowadays so many synagogues have, music that's kind of like upbeat, and there's kind of like a quicker rhythm to it. And so there's like a style, right, in terms of think of like Ashkenazi synagogues, with the shuckling, right, with the going back and forth, right? There's kind of like an intensity to it. You can't shuckle to the Spanish and Portuguese service because it's so laid back. So if you're like going back and forth and the music is slow, it's out of rhythm with each other, right? So everything is a bit more relaxed. You sit back, you sing along, it's a bit more almost like meditative, in its style, and so that's again something that you see that even within the music of the synagogue and how it impacts the minhag is something which is very of the place in where the community coalesced in Western Europe, right, and then ultimately in the Americas as well. That's a bit about the music. Yeah, we're going to kind of see these themes repeated. I hope this isn't ultimately boring in its repetitiveness, but actually when you start seeing it appearing in all these different areas, it starts to kind of become obvious, yeah, that this is clearly what's happening over here. Okay, so we've done architecture, we've done music. Let's move on to clothing, okay? So I have over here a couple things I want to talk about. So one is hats, yeah? So in the top right, you can see this rabbi who was in Jamaica in the 19th century, yeah? He's wearing the tri-corner hat, yeah? You can see this fine-looking rabbi over here, yeah? Wearing the top hat, yeah? And what's interesting is if you look in this drawing in the bottom over here, it was done by a gentleman by the name Belisario in the early 19th century. Right, this is the interior of Bevis Mark Synagogue. And you can see the man on the right, he's got the bands. We'll talk about the bands in a second. So he's the rabbi, yeah? So he's got the tri-corner hat. And the other gentleman, he's got the top hat. So if you came to the community in the 18th century, everyone's wearing tri-corner hats. By the time you get to the end of the 19th century, everyone is wearing top hats. But during the 19th century, there's some people wearing top hats, some people wearing tri-corner hats, right? The rabbis, the ministers wore the tri-corner hats probably longer than the rest of the people did, but then eventually even the rabbis switched over to top hats too, right? And again, the headwear is in keeping with the style of where they lived, right? So if you would have walked in a Spanish Portuguese synagogue in the 18th century, everyone would have had tri-corner hats, probably the ruffled shirts, the buckles on their shoes, they would have been dressed the way just people would have been dressed in London or in Amsterdam or wherever in that time period, right? They would be trying to dress, kind of like in the most kind of like a gentlemanly style, yeah, the women too in their style, right, of the time and place where they were living. As you move into the 19th century and it's falling out of style to wear the tri-corner hats and people are starting to wear the silk top hats, right? So the community begins to adapt and change that style of hats too. Nowadays, well, nothing really replaced top hats. So just keep wearing top hats. Baseball hats don't quite have the right feel. Yeah, so largely they kept wearing top hats. But if you go to the Spanish and Portuguese in New York, people wear a variety of hats, the bowler hats, Panama hats, different kinds of hats that were popular there, but maybe differently in London. So you see that, again, within the clothing, they're trying to dress in the style, right? You don't find a Spanish Portuguese Jew, wearing the strimal and bekisha, that's kind of clothing you might find, right, Eastern European Jews wearing, right? There's nothing distinctively Jewish about it historically, except that was probably what people wore in Poland in the 16th, 17th century, and the Jewish people who were there just kept dressing that way even into the 21st century, yeah? So the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were living in Italy and in England, and so fit in with the style of dress within those places. What's interesting is it wasn't only kind of the people, right? Even the clothing of the ministers, right? The rabbis, the chazanim in the community were also in keeping with the style of dress of that professional class in the places that they lived, right? So nowadays, right, if you look at, right, the way, right, the two rabbis here are dressed, so they have the robe and the bands, that most people see that now and it looks very much like what a priest would wear, right? But if you go back to the 17th century, it would have been university professors, it would have been scholars and clergy, So they also dressed that way because that's how a clergy person would dress. And it was quite common in Western Europe among all Jewish communities, not only Spanish and Portuguese, for the clergy of the synagogue to wear the robes, the canonicals, and the bands, and maybe a hat. And then it kind of fell out of practice within most synagogues. But again, the Spanish and Portuguese have largely retained that style of dress, right? Because that was kind of, again, because of the continuity of the synagogues. So, things often change when communities move buildings or obviously move towns. Because the Spanish and Portuguese have been in the same cities for centuries, it's easier to kind of retain and keep doing things the way you were doing them before, even if maybe elements in the world have changed around you. Well, within your building, you just know what you did last week, so you do it the following week as well. But that style is very Western European in that style, and so the rabbis also looked the part. That's what a member of the clergy or the scholarly class, that's how they would dress. And so the rabbi, the chazan, or the teachers, or the dayanim, whatever it was, kind of the religious figures of the community, would have also dressed in those styles as befitting their positions that they lived in. Even though today it looks to us something which is so different. And so again, in terms of their clothing, they're dressing, fitting in simply with the places where they live. Which again, maybe shouldn't be surprising to us, but it almost feels like now we think of traditional Jews dress in a counterculture kind of way, or in a way that reflects the way, maybe people had dressed a long time ago. But the Spanish and Portuguese Jews dressed in keeping with the times in which they lived. And they did that, right? And so, they simply fit in the places where they were living. And that was, once again, kind of reinforces what we're saying, is that the community is not looking to kind of be other. They're part of the place they live. They're part of the world. And so they're going to fit in the styles of the places in which they live, even while being rabbis, or even while being obviously Jewish people going to synagogue, right? They're still going to dress in the finery of the times in which they are living. So again, you can kind of see how the style of clothing also is kind of incorporated into the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish communities. The last thing I want to kind of focus on is, and here we'll get a little bit into the minhagim, the customs, a bit more, but is on religious objects. And even seeing how religious objects are to a degree incorporating the styles of the places where they live, right? The Western Sephardi, the kind of the Western European aesthetic. So let's talk about one which people often notice when they come into synagogue, which is the way that men are wearing the talet. So if you go into most synagogues nowadays, right, people have the talet on their shoulders. We come to Spanish and Portuguese, right? Not everyone, but for the most part, right, people are wrapping their talet forward, right? They're not putting it on the shoulder. They're kind of putting it over their arms and wearing it forward. Now, there's a religious reason for it. It's the idea that you should perhaps be wrapped in the talet, right? The blessing is lihitatef batzitzit, to wrap oneself with the tzitzit. So how do you wrap yourself? Well, literally, you wrap yourself in it, right? If you just put it on your shoulders, some people say, well, that's not wrapping yourself, right? You're just kind of wearing it. But if you bring it all forward, you've kind of wrapped yourself in it, perhaps. But historically also, and this may be also part of it, the materiality of the talet was silk. Yeah. Even nowadays, most talet are made out of wool. Yeah. So wool is a rougher material, obviously, than silk. And shall we say halachically or kind of religiously, there's a preference for wool over silk for different, because of the material of the tzitzit, without kind of getting into all the details of it. But what's interesting is, despite that, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews made their talitot out of silk. Why did they do it out of silk? Because silk was considered more beautiful. So if you're going to wear this religious garment, you want it to be out of the most beautiful material you can find. So even though, in a sense, almost religiously wool is preferable, silk was considered preferable to them because it was more beautiful. And what a more beautiful way to observe the mitzvah of doing the tradition. But I can tell you about silk, because I wear a silk talet. You can't put it on your shoulders. It slides right off. Yeah. So that may have also played a role in kind of then the way that we observe the mitzvah is by just wrapping it all forward, because really you almost have no choice. You can't do it on your shoulders. Yeah, even if you wanted to, right? And so it's wrapped forward. Be that as it may, that element of wearing silk would have felt so beautiful. You think of Western Europe in the 18th century, and how precious silk was. Yeah, that would have been, you come to synagogue and everyone's wearing beautiful silk material. Maybe the ladies have silk dresses. Yeah, and just how magnificent, right? That would have all been. It's shimmering in the light. Yeah, it's something which is really quite beautiful. So again, even kind of with the religious objects, they're taking on board the aesthetic of the places where they live, even when it may have some religious implications to doing that, but there is kind of a preference for doing things that are, beautiful within the worlds in which they're living, right? In England or Italy or wherever it may be. Now, you'll find that also in terms of some of the other materiality. So in the middle over here, this is a close-up of one of the Torah mantles, the vestments, the cloak that you put on the Torah. Yeah, and so historically, you would have found many of the Torah mantles would have been this kind of materiality. Again, fine material, very kind of, sometimes you'd find a brocade in terms of its design, right? These very kind of precious fabrics that are being used, right? So not kind of as you might think of today in kind of most synagogues where they have like maybe a simple velvet, kind of material, right? They again are using like really what for that time was like really precious, maybe very fine needlework, right? Beautiful, again, maybe silk strings and so on. And again, they're trying to you're going to decorate the Torah with the material that you think is the most beautiful. Right, so it reflects the time and the kind of what would have been the most beautiful materials of the time. You would find sometimes even people would take their wedding dresses and afterwards turn them into Torah mantles and give them to the synagogue, right? You take the most beautiful material you have and then use it for this mitzvah, right? For this holy thing. So you find some of the Torah covers are magnificent from kind of a fabric point of view, because they're taking the most beautiful fabrics. But again, it's the kind of fabrics that you would think of as being what you might find on beautiful fabrics that you'd find in the homes of the beautiful country homes, and maybe in the palaces and things like that, that kind of quality. But you're putting it onto the Torah. Yeah, so again, it shows the reverence for the Torah and kind of taking it and integrating it into your religious life, right? So these really precious fabrics aren't just for you to wear out when you go out for an evening, but if that's so special, you want the Torah, you want your synagogue to have those special things too, right? So your synagogue's not a dump, but you look like $1 million, right? No, you want the synagogue also to have that quality, right? It shows the value that you place in your religious life. And then one other thing I just want to point out are sometimes the silver work of the community. So here we have a few things here, right? These are some Torah bells, right? We call the rimonim. There you have actually a spice container, right, for the bisamim, for the havdalah at the end of Shabbat. Yeah, and again, you can see here again some of the kind of the Western styles, right? So the bisamim box is kind of like this tiered thing, right? And again, you might find that on like almost like the top of buildings, right? Maybe even the tops of churches, right? That have towers, yeah, on the top of them, right? That sometimes would have these like kind of like very intricate steeples type of work. So you might find that sometimes then in the silver within the synagogue, whether it's a Torah mat, not this one, but you sometimes will find some that look very much like those, almost like those steepled type towers on top of, you know, prominent buildings or even churches, right? That they also have that kind of style to them, right? So they are designing religious objects that are maybe even pulling in inspiration from the buildings in the places where they live, right? Because again, those buildings are constructed based on whatever is an aesthetic, you know, that has aesthetic appeal in those times and places, and so they're incorporating those things into the synagogue as well, right? And so one of the motifs you find quite a lot with the Torah bells, of course they'll have bells, because the point is when the Torah is moving, you hear it clinking, so you know the Torah is on the move, so you know to stand up, yeah? And it kind of, the Torah describes that the high priest had bells on the bottom of his robe, and so again, you would have known the high priest is coming, so we do that on our Torahs too. But again, what do you find on the top of these ones? Right, you find crowns, right? So that's very English, you know, kind of very kind of the monarchies, you know, and again, God is the king, right? So, but again, you're taking these elements that are maybe associated with a human king, and you're adapting it to, you know, the king where you live, right? So crowns, right? So you maybe don't think of that as much in like North Africa or, you know, other places, right? But that's very like Western European, you know, these European monarchs with their crowns, right? And so on. And so then you find that being incorporated into the Torah bells, right, that are in the synagogue too. So again, you can see how over and over and over again, the community is drawing on the aesthetic of the places where they live, yeah, where they find themselves, which is a Western European style. You know, and again, ultimately across the Atlantic as well. And so, whether you're talking about the architecture of the buildings, you know, whether you're talking about the music, whether you're talking about the clothing, whether you're talking about religious objects, over and over and over again, the community is pulling from the style and the place where they lived. But over and over again, right, these are all for being Jews, right? This is all for living a Jewish life, right? You're making decorations for the Torah. You're designing a synagogue, right? You are having the clothing for the rabbi. It's the music for the tefillah, for the prayers, right? And all those other things are traditional, right? It's the synagogue is built the way a synagogue should be built, right? The prayers are the correct prayers, right? The rabbi is a scholar in Judaism, right? The things you're decorating are the objects for use in a synagogue, right? So it's all as Jews, but it's being inspired, right, aesthetically from this world in which they find themselves. And so you see that there is this interplay between kind of being Western and being Jewish, yeah, that comes together within the Spanish and Portuguese Jews in a quite kind of almost coherent, intentional, certainly unapologetic type of way. Yeah, and what it reflects is that there is a embrace, maybe not even almost, and in this way I would almost say not even like intentionally, like not with the sense of we're doing this despite it being uncomfortable, but a sense of this being the most comfortable, obvious, normal thing to do, that you are a Jew and you're part of the place in which you live. And no sense that like those two things shouldn't fit together or might be in conflict with one another, because why shouldn't you be equally a Jew and British, or equally Italian, or equally American, but also being kind of a committed, proud, Jewish person, and feeling like that's just normal. Yeah? And so it's not like a thing where, maybe they're being uncomfortable of like, oh my gosh, I've stopped. No, this is just, what do you mean? We're people, we live in this place. This is the style that we like, and we're Jews at the same time. Yeah? And so that ability to kind of truly value that idea of integration, right? That ability to see themselves as part of the place in which they lived is something that really gets into kind of this religious worldview and kind of the religious culture of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews of the Western Sephardim, yeah? Which is, I think, something that nowadays almost stands out, because we almost have the sense of, if you want to be a committed Jew, you need to almost kind of isolate yourself from society. You kind of like live apart, or you like really integrate, and then maybe you kind of assimilate. Yeah, kind of you maybe you weaken your religious kind of affiliation or your religious observance, yeah, in order to kind of find a way to do that. And the Spanish and Portuguese represent this idea that kind of sees a false equation in both of those approaches, that says you don't need to, in order to maintain your Jewish self and your kind of robust religious life, you don't need to isolate yourself. And in fact, you can, while retaining that, also meaningfully kind of participate and integrate and kind of incorporate the best of the world around you, right? We saw that even when it came to, right, education, right? We saw the kind of integration of Western education styles. We saw that in terms of how the S&P organized itself institutionally, right? It was borrowing on models of Western styles of kind of structure of institutions. We saw that in terms of customs and aesthetic, right? Over and over again, it's this ability to kind of be Jewish, be true to one's identity, but to kind of incorporate elements into the places where they come from, or where they lived. And so it's not surprising that after kind of centuries, there becomes something which is really distinctively Spanish and Portuguese, right? Western Sephardi, having been in Western Europe for centuries while maintaining their Jewishness, that it ultimately kind of creates something which is quite identifiable as, oh, that's S&P, right? So even if you go to an S&P synagogue in America or in France or in Italy or in the Netherlands or in the UK, you can tell you're in an S&P synagogue, right? There's something that's coherent about it that feels S&P. And it's not necessarily something which is a copy of what was done in Spain or in Portugal or in a particular place. There may be elements that are drawn from there. It's certainly the framework that it's coming from, but ultimately it seems like it kind of coalesces into something distinct, in the 17th, 18th centuries, and then carries on, right, into the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, where it's resulted in something which is beautiful, right, which is magnificent, that has a grandeur to it, a kind of a classiness to it, and something which is quite uplifting and feels really different from other Jewish communities, right? And so that's not critiquing other Jewish communities, but it's saying this is also really special and should really be protected and preserved, and should be there to inspire people who want to connect with that, who kind of see that as a model that they would like to follow in their religious life, to say, I want to be really Jewish, but I also want to be really, Western at the same time, and to say, well, can I do that? Well, you can if you're in the Spanish and Portuguese, right? You can kind of find inspiration in that for how that can be done. And kind of collectively, all of these things, kind of from the way the community is structured, the educational kind of approach, the unique customs and the aesthetics kind of collectively create this religious culture of the Western Sephardim, right, which today we call the S&P, right, or the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Questions? Yes.
Yes. So basically, there's some things that I'm uncomfortable with because I realized, so on the building, they are very similar to like Christian buildings you would find in the Caribbean. And on the outside, there's no Star of David. Then, like you mentioned, the rabbi, they have the Napoleon hat, and then later they had the ground hat that you wear. So the kippas are not showing. Then the music, like you said, the prayers are affected because it's slow-paced. So I'm wondering, like, by trying to fit in so much and kind of take example on churches, like architecture, like, trying really to blend in and not fit in and not attract attention, like Star of David or the kippah showing, like, is it like in keeping with the halacha and like being, like, how can I say? Because by trying to fit in, it's like they're not showing off to be they're Jewish almost, right? Like like we don't see the kippahs anymore of the rabbis, and like on the outside they wouldn't be like Star of David, which is. Are there any Star of David on Baby Smart Synagogue, like on the outside?
So it's interesting. So Stars of David is a more recent thing.
Really?
If you go back to medieval times, you won't find any synagogues with Stars of David. It was just like a decorative thing. It's only later that it becomes like something that we think of as Jewish.
Okay.
Right? So it wouldn't have been willful to not have a Star of David. It wasn't a thing. Yeah, that only comes a bit later, that starts to become a style. You find it in Iberian places too, because again, it's something which is geometric. So you might find it in kind of again in Andalusia type style. It seems like it kind of in again more in kind of the 19th century in Central Europe. I told you there's this interest to kind of adopt more kind of Moorish style. So the Star of David kind of becomes a bit more prominent and then kind of flows from there. So we think of it as this like very ancient, because it's called Star of David, and there's a tradition that the King David had that style of shield. There may be something to that, but kind of in terms of Jews really saying, this is the way we're going to identify it, is a bit newer. You do find it in one place in Bevis Marks. On the back of the choir seats, when you first walk into the synagogue, you'll see it's in the woodwork. There's a Star of David. The choir seats were installed in the 1840s. So again, by then it was already becoming a more common Jewish motif, and so it did make its way in. But in the 18th century, it would have just not been something they would have even thought of to have. And again, if you kind of look at rabbis in other Jewish communities, they're all wearing hats. They're wearing other kinds of hats. Yeah, right? It's just in this community, they wore this kind of hat. Now, when they weren't wearing hats, they would have had some kind of head covering.
Yeah.
They would have covered their head with something probably.
Right.
But yeah, there's definitely an approach that kind of says we don't need to stand out. They're not doing anything against the halakha, yeah? But I think nowadays we associate kind of Jews as like you need to like intentionally, like separate yourself. And that wasn't the approach of the community. They said, retain your practices, be true to your faith, keep Shabbat, keep kosher, but you don't need to like, when you walk in the street, necessarily look different. Why? Why should you? I mean, you just dress like anybody. You don't have to wear some clothing that makes you look like you're from a different place. You can dress in the style of the places where you live, and that's okay. Yeah, I think you had your next. Yeah.
Thank you. So, is that happening in Yom Kippur? That's why we don't wear white?
Oh, I actually meant to talk about that in the class. I forgot to. Yeah, so there's the question of what to wear in Yom Kippur is a great example of this issue, because it's actually spoken about in a work that was produced in this community in the first half of the 20th century, the Keter Shem Tov, by the Chacham Gagin, who wrote a work called this Keter Shem Tov, and he actually discusses this question. He says many Sephardic communities, the people wear all white on Yom Kippur. So he says, why don't they do that in London? And he says, in London, apparently at that time, people would wear what's it called? Not just suits. They would wear, with the bow ties, tuxedos. People would wear tuxedos. Yeah, or morning suits. Yeah, morning suits. And he says, what's going on over here? He said, yes, there's this idea that on Yom Kippur you should wear white. So it's very strange that people are coming to synagogue all dressed in black. So he said, because in the places where they lived, it's not like it's a hot climate. Yeah? And so to walk around in all white clothing, in October, you would look like a weirdo. Yeah? So he said there's no mitzvah to be weird. So in the places where they were, what was considered dignified, the nicest clothing you could wear is your morning suit. So they would wear morning suits to synagogue on Yom Kippur. He says this is not North Africa. This is not the Middle East. So why are you wearing all white? If you wear all white in the street in London in October, people are like, who are these crazy people? So they wore morning suits. And he's not saying it in a negative way. He's saying that's what was appropriate for being in London. That's beautiful. You come to synagogue on Yom Kippur, the holiest day, and everyone is wearing these really beautiful type of clothing. They're not wearing leather shoes. You can't wear leather on Yom Kippur, but they're otherwise wearing, stuff that feels really dignified and appropriate to a kind of a significant occasion. So that's a great example, again, of where you can see the custom is kind of taking on board the realities of where they're living.